So last week, we started a new series called The Final Words. So if you missed last week, you can catch up online. So for the next few weeks, we are looking at John 13 to 17. So Jesus is teaching his disciples. He is preparing them for the big changes that are coming up ahead. So this teaching happens right at the end of Jesus' last week on earth. So these are the last things he wants his disciples to remember. So this is a big deal. And it's important for us that we get these things not just into our heads, but also into our hearts. So like Ryan discussed last week, there are a bunch of themes in these passages that we see over and over and over. So one of these themes, definitely my favorite, is the theme of love. So in these passages, we see the word love or loved 33 times. Now, I know that because I actually read it and counted. I didn't just Google it. And so in most Bibles, the words that Jesus has spoken are in red letters, but in my Bible now, it's fluorescent orange letters. So I want to start this morning with a story. When Eli was just born, more than 13 years ago. Actually, I'd just like to pause and honour Eli this morning. He's doing the AV and he's doing an outstanding job. All the slides have just been perfect. So when he was just born more than 13 years ago, Sam and I were so excited to be parents that we signed up for a toolbox parenting course. And these courses are brilliant. Charlotte runs them at the moment if you are interested in going along. So we signed up for one called the Early Years. So we had a newborn baby who couldn't do anything. He couldn't even lift his head or roll over. He definitely couldn't sit up on his own. And here we were focusing mostly on the behaviour of toddlers and how best to handle toddlers. So looking back, it was maybe a little premature and a little ridiculous that we were there with our newborn, but all our friends had gathered with their newborns and we were all so excited and we all had a great time just eating snacks and dreaming about how wonderful we would be at this stuff when we eventually got there and when our kids actually started doing something. Now, one of the evenings was centered around the idea of having a family motto. Something that summed up your hopes and dreams for your family, expressing the stuff that was really important for your family. And I just loved this idea. I thought, how awesome to have a family motto. And I remember prayerfully considering what I would include in ours. And so I would love to share those words of wisdom with you right now. But sadly, I can't, because I didn't write anything. Because anxiety set in and I wanted it to be brilliant and perfect, and so I didn't actually write anything at all. I felt overwhelmed at the idea of expressing these big dreams I had for my family in a few sentences. So to this day, we don't have a family motto. But when I was writing this talk, I said to the kids, "What's our family motto?" And they said to me, "Well, we don't have a family motto." And I said, "Well, maybe we do. Maybe Dad and I know what it is, but you guys don't know. What do you think it is?" And this is what they said. There's three of them. This is what they said. Do what Jesus would do. Be kind always. Be peaceful. Be positive. Don't give up. Have fun. I know, I was pretty stoked with that. So new tactic, if you don't have a family motto, just wait till your kids get to a certain age and then ask them and they'll write you a really good one. But at the time I was pondering what this amazing family motto would be, I went to my friend Lizzie McGregor, who was our senior pastor, and I said, "What is your family motto?" Because she had this beautiful family. And she said it's 5 things. Be kind, be kind, be kind, be kind, be kind. And it was brilliant, and I should have just stolen it at the time. The reality is I say be kind in my house at least 100 times a day. I start off in a kind voice. I end up in a fairly psychotic voice. We need to say this constantly, don't we? Be kind, be kind. I have 3 children, and the biggest desire in my heart is that they love each other, that they're kind to each other. Now, they've all been raised the same, and they're all boys, and they're mostly into the same stuff. So most of the time, they get on really well, and they do love each other really well, and they are mostly kind. But there's only 3 of them. God wants his children to all be kind to each other, but that's every single one of us. Look up and down the rows. It's everyone here. God has 8.2 billion children and counting, and he wants them to be kind to each other, which is a big dream, and at times a difficult dream. I think if God was going to have a family motto, it would be what we see that's expressed in these passages in John 13 to 17, because he says the same thing over and over and over. He says, love one another. John 13:34, Jesus says, a new command I give you. And you can imagine that the disciples are sitting on the edge of their seats here, and they're wondering, oh man, something new, what's he going to say? And then he says, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. And then a little further on, he says, my command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. And then about 5 seconds later, he says again, this is my command: love each other. And he's really hammering it home. He's saying it over and over, and he needs to. He says it over and over. We need to say it over and over to ourselves, to our families, to our communities. He describes it here as a new commandment. But love is not a new concept. We see love weaved through the Old Testament. In Leviticus, the Israelites are taught to love their neighbor as themselves. And earlier on in the book of Matthew, Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. So the disciples are probably thinking, well, this isn't new. But N.T. Wright explains the newness isn't that they've heard it before, it's the depth and type of the love. He's saying, love one another in the same way that I have loved you. You've watched me, you've walked with me, you've slept beside me, you've eaten with me, you've prayed with me. Now copy me. So they're to look back on his life, his speed of life, his way of life, and find a pattern, a shape, a picture of what love looks like. We need to remember that just before he said this, he got down on his hands and knees like a slave, and he humbled himself, and he washed their manky, stinky feet. And it was incredibly unexpected and beautiful and powerful. So he's saying to them, love like I have loved you. But what sort of love is he talking about? Well, he's talking about love defined as agape in the Greek. So it's a certain type of love. Our culture is obsessed with love. There's an endless stream of poems and songs and movies all written about love. But the way that our culture defines love is primarily not agape love. We often think of love as a feeling, as an attraction towards something or affection for something. So often when we say we love something, what we actually mean is that we like it. I would say I love edamame beans. Have I got any fellow lovers out there? Yes, the cars makers, good people like beans, it turns out. I love edamame beans. I love them all day long. I could have a long conversation, in fact I will after the service with you guys, about the joy of them. They're nutritious and delicious. If edamame beans were a person, then they would be one of my best friends for sure. So I just love them. But the love I have for the edamame beans is not the same as agape love. The love I have for the beans is I want to consume them, I want to eat them, I want to enjoy them for my own pleasure. I want to do that just for my own gratification. So often when we say we love something, whether that's God or it's a person, what we mean is we want to consume it for our own pleasure. We want to take from it to make us feel good, not give to it. Our culture finds it really hard to distinguish between love and lust, between self-giving and self-seeking. So when love is turned upside down and distorted, it's because we've put ourselves at the center, not God and other. When we put ourselves at the center, the thing that we are professing to love just turns into something for our self-gratification. Agape love that Jesus is talking to his disciples about is not just a feeling. Although you would expect genuine feelings to arise in the heart, it is not something that we do just for our own pleasure. Michael Wilkins, who's a scholar on Matthew, said this: love is an unconditional commitment to an imperfect person in which one gives oneself to another to bring the relationship to God's intended purposes. Dallas Willard defines agape as this: love is not a feeling, but the divine way of relating to others and oneself that moves through every dimension of our being and restructures our world for God. And John Mark Comer, he says this: to love God is to give ourselves to God and let him shape us for his intended purposes. To love our neighbor is to give ourselves to them, to partner with God, to shape them for his intended purposes. Agape love is all about the other person. It is self-sacrificial love. N.T. Wright says, love overflows into service, not in order to show off how hardworking it is, but because that is its natural form. So if we look back at chapter 15, Jesus says, greater love has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends. And that is what Jesus literally did. He laid down his life. He went to the cross. He died so that we can walk into places of freedom and find closeness with God. And we've probably heard amazing stories of other people doing this, laying down their lives. There's these incredible moments across history of self-sacrifice where someone actually saves another person but loses their life in the process. But Jesus is also speaking metaphorically too. There are other ways that we can lay down our lives for others that don't mean we have to literally die, which is actually really good news because it's simpler and we can actually start there. Laying down our life for another is when we put someone else first, when we care more about them, when we care more about seeing them thrive than we do about pushing ourselves to the top. It's when we sacrifice our time and our money and our energy for the last and the least, or those on the outskirts. When we show mercy to those who don't deserve it, or we forgive those who have hurt us. When we humble ourselves and when we serve. Jesus modeled agape, self-sacrificial love, not just in the way that he died, but also in the way that he lived, because he lived for the other. He prayed for people. He healed people. He got alongside people. He responded with kindness when he was interrupted. Philippians 2 says he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant. So he humbled himself. He spent his life building others up. That is the picture of love that we are called to follow. Most of you have probably heard of the love languages. So this is a concept that was developed by a guy called Gary Chapman. And the love languages are different ways of expressing and receiving love. And so the idea is that there are these 5 different ways. So he would say they are words of affirmation, quality time, physical touch, gifts, and acts of service. And so the idea is that not everyone communicates love in the same way, and likewise, not everyone wants to receive love in the same way. But often we can just love someone the way that we want to be loved. For example, Sam loves gifts. Have we got any other gift people out there? Not many, a few. He just loves them. He feels so loved when he gets a good gift. But that's not my love language. So I'm not that good at buying gifts. And if you're my friend and I haven't bought you a birthday present in years, sorry. That is an area I probably need to grow. But for me, I'm much more interested in the words in the card, the heartfelt words that Sam writes in the card. Words of affirmation are my love language. That's how I feel loved. So I have trained Sam that there's no point giving me a book or a journal or a devotional. If it doesn't have a thoughtful inscription, I'm sending it back. And he'll have to try again. And likewise, I try really hard to buy him good gifts. I have to put time and energy and thought into them. Then I have to find the moolah. You know, it might mean that we're eating noodles all week, but my husband will feel loved and he'll get a good present. Now, to quote the national coordinator of 24/7 prayer, that also happens to be my husband, Sam Harvey, he says this: God has a love language. God's love language is obedience. And we see it in this passage because he says it over and over again. Jesus says in John 14:21, who has my commands and keeps them is the one who loves me. The one who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I too will love them and show myself to them. And then literally 2 seconds later, he says this: anyone who loves me will obey my teaching. My Father will love them and will come to them and make our home with them. Anyone who does not love me will not obey my teaching. And then again in the next chapter, he's hammering it home. John 15, if you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. So this isn't legalism. This isn't about earning his love. It's not about being perfect. It's not trying to work for our salvation. It's about flowing with him, pleasing him, just like he obeyed his Father. He delights in us when we obey him. It brings an intimacy and a closeness with him. He doesn't just want us to believe in him, he wants us to follow him. And he doesn't just want us to follow him, he wants us to obey him. So loving him may be the easy part, but obeying him can seem a lot harder. We can actually spend the bulk of our lives just living our own way and ignoring God's prompts and God's teaching. And I know that full well because I spent a large chunk of my life just doing whatever I felt like doing. I wasn't listening to the still small voice of Jesus. I was making decisions that were incredibly unwise. I wasn't following the roadmap that we have in the Bible. I wasn't consulting the wisdom of those around me. I was just living for my own selfish desires. And I didn't have a faith crisis over this time. I just had an obedience crisis. I just stopped listening and doing what God was asking me to do. And it's easy to do, and it happens in small ways over time. But I can tell you that in the long run, that does not lead to life. John Mark Comer says, loving God and obeying God are inseparable. This is hard for us because often obedience to any external authority is seen as slavery and not freedom. It's seen as a barrier to human flourishing, not the way to fullness of life. Yet Jesus wants us to obey him because he knows it's the way to life. It's the way to the flourishing life. Often our way is motivated by the world, the flesh, and the devil, but God's way is always only motivated by love. Often we can obey God when all is going to plan, but in a stormy season, it can be much harder to trust him, to keep our eyes on him, and to do what he's asking us to do. If we think about Peter in the boat, Jesus is walking on the water, and the disciples are in the boat, and there is a storm, and the disciples are terrified. They're freaking out. And Peter sees Jesus, and Jesus says, come to me on the water, like step out of the boat. He's asking him to trust him. He's asking him to listen. He's asking him to obey. He's asking him to do what he's asking. And Peter starts really well with obedience, and he steps out of the boat. But then he panics. And I think his eyes are on the storm and his eyes are on the situation. And then he starts to sink. Jesus wants us to continue to trust and obey him even in the stormy seasons of our life. I can tell you now, it was easier to trust and obey God when we were in our comfortable home in Christchurch, responding to the exciting call to come to Napier, to plant a church, to step out in faith. It was easier to trust him then than it was to trust him a little bit down the line when we were in Napier and we didn't have any friends and we were struggling to pay for things and Charlotte wasn't here yet and Luke was sleeping on the floor in our kids' room. And I remember one day being on the phone to Gemma and just ranting about the fact that I didn't have enough money for groceries. And I was just annoyed about it. And then I got off the phone and literally in the next few minutes there was a knock on the door and someone from our very small community that had started to form just handed us a $200 Pack and Save voucher. And it was just the most amazing moment of God's provision and encouragement. And it's that reminder that he's saying, obey him even in the storms of life. Sometimes we can think we're pretty good at obeying God, but when we do what Jesus teaches just because we agree with him, that's not necessarily obeying. For example, the Bible says, don't kill your neighbor. Well, I can tell you now I have no desire to kill my neighbor. Doesn't sound like a good idea. It doesn't sound like a fun idea. Don't see any good fruit that would come from it. In fact, Luke and Charlotte are our neighbors and Cass and Joel. And if I killed my neighbor, who would feed my cat? That would be a major problem. So I'm not going to kill my neighbor. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm obeying God. I don't really want to do it. If we do what we think is best, and Jesus also thinks it's best, that's great. It might mean that our heart is aligned with God's and that we're moving with the Spirit. but it doesn't necessarily mean obedience. Maybe it's harder for us to be obedient with something like our money. God calls us to a life of generosity that's actually self-sacrificial generosity that hurts at times. We spend it on ourselves because we think that leads to more joy. But as someone who's done both, it just doesn't. It ends up being a big black hole of want that you can just never fully satisfy. And you just turn into a self-seeking, greedy person that still isn't satisfied. When we are generous, God grows us in self-sacrificial love. And that leads to blessing, that leads to life, that leads to more of His presence. And it also makes room for God to provide. John Mark says, obedience is when you do what Jesus teaches, even when you don't understand, but you trust Him. You trust His love, you trust His wisdom, you trust His authority over your life because He is God, not you. Ultimately, He is the one who is defining what's life-giving for us and what's soul-destroying, not us. When we love God, it doesn't just mean we've got this overflow of emotions for Him, although often that's the byproduct. It means that we shape our lives around His way. The reality is if we don't trust Him and we don't obey Him, then we don't love Him. If we don't obey Him, it means that we trust and love something more than we love Jesus. John Wimber, the founder of the Vineyard Movement, really inspires me with his obedience. So he's a pastor and he's working hard and he gets to the end of himself. He's burnt out and he says to God, he's just lost. He's asking God for guidance and then he feels like God says to him, I've seen your ministry, but now I want to show you mine. And so John humbles himself and prays, and then he and the other members of the leadership in their community feel like God's calling them to teach on and pray for supernatural healing. Now, John doesn't even know if he believes in supernatural healing at this point. He's never seen it, but they want to be obedient, and so they move with obedience, and they start teaching on healing and praying for healing every single week in their church. And week after week after week, nothing happens. And so it's hard to bring the church with them because they're not seeing anything, but they dig in and they keep going and they're walking the long road of obedience. They're walking that long road in the same direction. And eventually healing starts to break out after nearly a year in their church. And then miraculous healing is breaking out. And you can read all about it. A healing ministry is birthed there that actually sweeps the world. And it was birthed out of a place of obedience. So if we want more of God's presence, we need to obey Him. God's love language is obedience. If we want to say yes to the great command that Jesus gives us to love one another and to be known for our love, then we need to start with obedience. Because if we look back at John 15, Jesus says, if you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I've kept my Father's commands and remain in His love. So it's when we obey Him that we stay connected to the vine. It's then that we stay in step with Him. It's then that we abide in Him. We can't love people with this self-sacrificial love, agape, in our own strength. We can only truly love people in this radical, life-changing way if we remain in God's love. We need to remain in His love, and He tells us how to do it. He says, you remain in my love when you keep my commands. St. Augustine says the root problem in the human condition is disordered love. So the problem for us is not that we don't love, it's just that we love the wrong things or we love the wrong way. We love the easy things, the comfortable things, the things that make us feel successful. We love the things that puff us up, the things that distract us, the things that entertain us. But when we say yes to Jesus' way and we start obeying Him, it's then that He comes and He reorders our loves. Then we can trust His vision for our life. We can lay down our own agendas. Sam's Pop always used to say, trust and obey, for it is the only way. And the older I get, the more I see the gold in that little rhyme. It is the only way to life, trust and obey. Jesus talks about love so many times in these final words because he knows that's the picture of spiritual maturity, how well His disciples are loving. That's the goal. He wants his disciples to grasp it, and he wants us to grasp it. Pete Scazzero says, loving people well is the defining characteristic of a mature Christian. Lots of other things are wonderful, but the end is loving well. There's a whole passage in 1 Corinthians that talks about all these wonderful things. Faith that can move mountains, speaking in the tongues of angels, giving everything that you have to the poor. But at the end of the passage, it basically says, if you don't do these things with love, then they're not important. And the practices that we focused on last term, 9 different practices, all really important. There was Sabbath and prayer and scripture and mission, all kinds of things. They're not a measure of spiritual maturity. How do we know if we're making progress? Are we becoming more loving year after year after year? If we want to be people of agape that receive the healing love of God and then share it with the world, then we need to let God love us first. That's really key. John 1 says, we love because he first loved us. So we need a fresh revelation of this over and over and over, that God's love is excessive and extravagant, it's outrageous, it's scandalous. God's love is a love that's prepared to suffer. It's a vulnerable love. It's actually wide open to rejection. God's love isn't put off by our humanity. He's not turned away by our messiness. Romans tells us there's nothing that can separate us from the love of God. God's love is faithful even when we're unfaithful. He continues to pursue us. God doesn't seem to be very careful about the people that he loves. He loves every single one of us, no matter what we've done. He doesn't seem to be very careful about where he's trying to build his church. He wants all of us involved. He calls all of us to build his church. He pursues us in the face of our humanity and our brokenness and our messiness, our failures, our faults. He continues to pursue us. So if we want to love well, we need to experience the love of God. And how can we do that practically? Well, I just want to suggest 2 things. Firstly, we have to spend time with him in prayer, in lament, like really honestly, in the sad place when things aren't going well, in worship, in silence. We need to invite him into the broken places of our heart, the parts that we don't like, the parts that we try and keep hidden, and invite him in to transform us. Because as we experience God's love for us, then we learn to love ourselves, and then we have the capacity to love others. We abide in his love in order to love others. And secondly, Christian community, church, is one of the vehicles that God uses to teach us how to love. This is a diverse community, filled with lots of different types of people with different opinions and different ideas and different passions. If you are part of a Christian community, you will have to learn how to forgive. Your love will be growing and stretched. But we learn how to love as we commit to a community that is different from us. I want to finish with this. In the book of John that we're looking at, it's written by John, and John actually refers to himself a bunch of times, but he doesn't call himself John. He calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. So the passage might say, the disciple whom Jesus loved had rested his head against Jesus. And he's talking about himself. Now, I've heard people talk about this before and point to the fact that maybe it came from a place of arrogance or a place of self-centeredness, but I completely disagree. I had a time a while back when I was journaling, and I was really having a fresh revelation of God's love, just how amazing it is. And I kept writing in my journal, Abba, which means father, or it means dad, and then in brackets, who loves me. So I wrote, Abba, who loves me, and then I would pour out my prayers, and it was like a love letter to Jesus. And then next passage, Abba, in brackets, who loves me. And it wasn't coming from a place of arrogance, it was coming from a place of awe. I was having such a new, fresh understanding of God's love, and I could barely believe it, that he would love me with my failures and my faults, but yet he does. And I was like, I got to get this into me. I got to get this into my head and my heart, so I kept writing at Abba, who loves me. And it's the same with John in this passage, I think. John says, the disciple whom Jesus loved, and he's trying to remind himself, hey, that's who I am. You know, other people call me other stuff, but that's who I am. And so the invitation today is for all of us to know that's who we are. You are the disciple whom Jesus loved. So we are going to end here, and we're going to spend some time in God's love. We're going to move into a time of confession and communion. So we've just got space to do some business with God. And in the confession, it's not a place where we come and God makes us feel small. It's a place where we come so that we can experience his mercy and his grace and remember that we are the disciple that he loved. It's a place where we can lay down the moments where we didn't follow God's way. And there's always that invitation to make a fresh commitment to seek God, to follow God, to work out what he's saying, where he's leading, and to obey him, and in doing so, pour out your love to him.